August 18th, 1966. A rubber plantation east of Nui Dat, South Vietnam. Through sheets of monsoon rain, a Viet Cong battalion commander watches something that shouldn't be possible. His men have been attacking for over an hour, wave after wave. Hundreds of soldiers, artillery, machine guns, everything they have. The Australians should have broken by now. They should have run. They should have died. But they're still there, still firing, still holding the line. Every burst is measured, every shot deliberate. The radio traffic is steady. No panic, no screaming, just calm voices coordinating fire and movement. The commander realizes something his superiors didn't tell him, something the intelligence reports got wrong. The Australians aren't like the others. This is the story almost never told. Not just what happened at Long Tan, but what the enemy thought when they faced Australians for the first time in force, what they expected, what they found instead, and what they learned the hard way. In early 1966, when the Australian task force arrived in Phuoc Tuy province, the Viet Cong had every reason to be confident. They knew this terrain. They'd been fighting here for years. They had the support of local villages, supply lines through the jungle, and momentum. And now, another foreign military showing up to try their luck. The VC intelligence reports were straightforward. The Australians were British Commonwealth forces, close allies of the Americans. Similar equipment, similar tactics. Translation: another Western unit that would patrol in large, noisy groups, rely too heavily on firepower, and could be bled through ambush and attrition. Just another target. They were half right. But within weeks, something started showing up in VC after-action reports. The Australians moved differently. American patrols were often easy to hear, coming radio chatter, talking, cigarette smoke. They moved in large groups and stuck to predictable patterns. The Australians? They appeared out of the jungle without warning. Silent, patient, aware. VC sentries would hear nothing, then suddenly, there they were, 50 meters away, sometimes closer. The VC started using a term. Ma Lin. Ghost soldiers. Early contacts taught the VC something else. Australians didn't spray bullets wildly. They aimed. Every shot had a purpose. Automatic weapons were used in short, controlled bursts. Single shots for single targets. Fire discipline. It's a small thing. But in the jungle, where ammunition and visibility are everything, it mattered. And the VC noticed. What they didn't realize at first was why. The Australian infantry were conscripts and regulars, yes, but they were led by corporals and sergeants who'd spent years in the bush. Malaya, Borneo, jungle warfare specialists. These weren't officers learning tactics from books. These were NCOs who knew how to read ground, control fire, and keep men alive through discipline and experience. The Viet Cong respected NCO leadership. They built their own units around it. When they saw how Australian sections operated tight, professional, steady, they recognized something familiar. An enemy who knew what they were doing. By mid-1966, the VC in Phuoc Tuy had adjusted their intelligence assessments. The Australians were dangerous on patrol. Quiet, accurate, hard to ambush. But surely, they thought, under sustained attack, under weight of numbers and massed fire, they'd break like any other foreign unit. No one, they believed, could stand against a full regiment attack. The intelligence wasn't entirely wrong. The Australians were formidable on patrol, but the VC made a critical error in their analysis. They confused tactical competence with strategic vulnerability. They believed that while Australian sections might be dangerous in small engagements, A company-sized element, isolated and outnumbered, would collapse under the weight of a regimental assault. This thinking was rooted in experience. The VC had fought the French for years. They'd learned that European armies, for all their technology and training, had a breaking point. Push hard enough, sustain pressure long enough, and even the best units would fracture. Officers would lose control. Radio discipline would collapse. Men would scatter. It had worked at Dien Bien Phu. It had worked in countless smaller engagements across Indochina. The VC leadership had no reason to believe it wouldn't work again. But the Australians weren't the French, and they weren't fighting a colonial war they didn't believe in. Every man in D Company had volunteered for Vietnam or been conscripted and trained to a standard that prioritized small unit initiative and personal responsibility. They'd been taught that when things went wrong, and they would go wrong, the section commander kept fighting, the corporal kept leading, the private kept shooting. There was no plan B that involved surrender or retreat without orders. The VC didn't understand this yet. They would learn it in the rain and mud of a rubber plantation, at a cost that would shock their commanders and reshape their tactics for years to come. On August 17, 1966, the Viet Cong 275th Regiment began moving into position near the Australian base at Nui Dat. Over 2,000 soldiers. Their plan was simple: draw out a small Australian force, isolate them, and destroy them with overwhelming numbers before reinforcements could arrive. They expected a quick victory, a propaganda coup, proof that the Australians, like everyone else, could be beaten. They were about to meet D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 108 men, and learn a lesson that would change their training doctrine for the rest of the war. 4:08 p.m., August 18th, 1966. D Company is moving through a rubber plantation about 4 kilometers east of Nui Dat. They're following up after a mortar attack on the base the night before. Standard sweep. Looking for the enemy launch site. The weather is appalling. Monsoon rain turning the ground to slurry. Visibility down to meters. Every man is soaked through. And then 11 platoon makes contact. Not a probe. Not a skirmish. A wall of fire. The Viet Cong believed they had every advantage. The weather reduced visibility. Australians couldn't see what was coming. The plantation terrain limited maneuver. Australians couldn't flank. And most importantly, D Company was alone. Cut off. 4 kilometers from base. By the time reinforcements arrived, the VC expected the battle to be over. But from the very first moments, something went wrong. No panic in the radio calls. The platoons began contact drills, immediate action, returning fire, taking cover behind the rubber trees. Section commanders started controlling their men's fire. Aimed shots. Pick your targets. Conserve ammunition. This is what the Viet Cong didn't expect. They expected chaos. Troops firing wildly. Officers losing control. What they got was discipline. Controlled bursts. Accurate fire. NCOs moving calmly between positions. Directing fire. Organizing ammunition distribution. One Viet Cong soldier later recalled the moment he realized something was different. We attacked. We expected them to run or fire everywhere. Instead, they shot back carefully. Like hunters, we lost men immediately. The Australians were outnumbered more than 10 to 1, but they were fighting like professionals, and the VC started taking casualties. The difference was immediately apparent to the VC commanders observing the battle. They'd engaged American units before, where the initial response was volume, Hundreds of rounds fired in all directions, creating noise and chaos but often hitting nothing. The psychological effect was impressive, but the tactical result was often negligible. The Australians were different, frighteningly different. Each shot seemed to have a purpose. Section commanders were visible through the rain, moving between positions, directing fire at specific targets. The VC noticed that Australian soldiers weren't shooting at movement or shadows. They were waiting for clear targets, then engaging with precision. This created a problem the VC hadn't anticipated. Their assault tactics relied on momentum waves of soldiers moving forward, accepting casualties, but maintaining pressure until the enemy's fire slackened or stopped. Against the Australians, the fire never slackened. It was methodical, relentless. Every time a VC soldier exposed himself to move forward, he became a target. The VC had more men, but the Australians were making every man count, and the mathematics of the battle were shifting in ways the VC commanders hadn't expected. They'd planned for a 2-to-1 exchange ratio acceptable losses for destroying an isolated company. Instead, they were losing 5, 6, sometimes 10 men for every Australian casualty. At this rate, they'd destroy D Company. But the cost would be catastrophic. The VC commanders faced a decision: press the attack and accept massive casualties, or withdraw and accept failure. Neither option was acceptable, so they committed more men, called up reserves, and ordered the assault to continue. They still believed the Australians would break. They had to break. Everyone broke eventually. The Viet Cong tactics were proven. Human wave assaults. Overwhelming fire. Keep the pressure on until the enemy breaks. It worked against the French. It worked against the South Vietnamese. It often worked against the Americans. It should have worked here, but D Company didn't break. The platoons formed a defensive perimeter. 3 platoons in a rough line, 4th in reserve. Spacing between men calculated. Fields of fire clear. When the VC charged, they ran into something they hadn't faced before: fire discipline at scale. The Australians weren't all firing at once. Sections took turns. One section fires, while another reloads. Overlapping arcs. Controlled. Relentless. Every burst counted. Every bullet hit. A VC company commander later described it: "We thought the Australians would waste ammunition like the Americans, but they fired slowly. Every shot hit someone. We couldn't get close. And then the artillery started." The Australians had something else the VC hadn't fully accounted for: New Zealand artillery batteries attached to the Australian task force, firing 105mm howitzers in the rain, in near-zero visibility, with devastating accuracy. Forward observers with D Company were calling in fire missions through the rain. Coordinates relayed, guns laid, rounds away, and hitting within meters of Australian positions. The VC expected the rain to make artillery useless. Instead, it was killing them in the open. One Viet Cong document captured later noted, "The Australian artillery coordination was faster than anything we had encountered. Even in terrible weather, they brought fire down within minutes." But still, the VC pressed on. They had numbers. They had orders. They believed weight of bodies would eventually overwhelm the Australians. So they kept attacking. By 5 p.m., D Company had been in continuous contact for nearly an hour. The rain was relentless, mud caking everything, weapons jamming, ammunition running low. Men were going down, wounded, killed. The perimeter was shrinking. This is where theory meets reality, where training meets terror, where every man asks himself the same question: do I stay or do I run? The Viet Cong were watching for the break, the moment when discipline cracks, when fear takes over, when soldiers start pulling back without orders. It's the moment that wins battles. But it didn't come. Corporals and sergeants were moving through the positions, checking weapons, redistributing ammunition, dragging wounded men back, mates pulling each other out of the line of fire, soldiers passing magazines to men running dry. Mateship, not sentimentality, not a recruiting slogan, a survival system. The VC noticed. When a man went down, others moved to cover him. When a section ran low on ammunition, runners sprinted through open ground to resupply them. No one left. No one quit. A Viet Cong platoon leader later described the moment it became clear. We expected them to break apart. They did not. They fought like a single organism. When we hit one section, the others supported immediately. There were no gaps. The rain kept falling. The VC kept attacking, and the Australians kept holding. But the VC were learning, even as they attacked. Their junior officers and NCOs were noting things that would appear in after-action reports, things that would be studied, things that would change how they fought Australians in the future. They noticed that when an Australian went down wounded, the response was immediate and organized. Not panicked, not chaotic. 2 men would move to cover the casualty, while others shifted to cover the gap in the line. The wounded man would be dragged back, still firing if he could. Medical treatment would begin immediately, even under fire. This was different from what they'd seen with other forces. With some units, when casualties mounted, cohesion collapsed. Men would cluster around wounded friends, exposing themselves, or they'd leave them and pull back, breaking the line. The Australians did neither. They extracted their wounded professionally and maintained their positions. The VC also noticed something else that troubled their commanders. The Australian radio discipline remained intact. Even after nearly 2 hours of combat, even with casualties mounting, the radio traffic they could intercept was calm and professional. Call signs were used correctly. Orders were clear and acknowledged. Fire missions were being called in with precision. This suggested something the VC didn't want to believe. The Australian command structure was intact. Officers and NCOs were still in control. The unit wasn't fragmenting into isolated groups fighting for survival. It was still functioning as a coordinated force. The system, and most troubling of all, the Australians weren't running low on ammunition yet. The steady rate of accurate fire continued, section by section, methodically covering each other, maintaining overlapping fields of fire. The VC had thrown everything at these men: artillery, mass assault, infiltration attempts, nearly 2 hours of sustained combat, and D Company was still fighting as a unit, still holding, still killing. 6 p.m., nearly 2 hours into the battle. The Viet Cong have committed everything they have, and they're getting through. Parts of the perimeter are being overrun, fighting at bayonet distance. Grenades, close combat, men grappling in the mud. 11 platoon is nearly cut off. Ammunition critical. Casualties mounting. This is the moment. But even now, even at the breaking point, the discipline holds. Platoon commanders are still giving clear orders. Sections are still moving in coordination. Fire is still controlled. The VC could not understand it. They'd broken units with less pressure than this. They'd routed companies that had more men and better positions. But these Australians refused to break. Years later, a Viet Cong veteran tried to explain it. We thought their will would shatter, but their will was stronger than ours that day. Even when we broke through their lines, they did not run. They fought harder. The Australian SLR rifle, the L1A1, firing 7.62 millimeters rounds. Heavy, accurate, reliable, even in the worst conditions, and in the hands of trained soldiers, devastating. The VC learned to fear that sound, the steady crack, crack, crack of aimed fire, because it meant Australians. And Australians didn't miss. 6:15 p.m. Through the rain and smoke, D Company hears something. Engines. APC's armored personnel carriers from 3 Troop, 1st APC Squadron, loaded with ammunition and reinforcements from a company, smashing through the rubber plantation at full speed. For the Viet Cong, this was the nightmare scenario. They'd committed everything to destroying D Company. Their formations were in the open, their assault lines extended, and now armored vehicles were hitting them in the flank. Machine guns firing from the APCs, infantry jumping off and attacking, artillery still falling, and D Company battered, exhausted, nearly out of ammunition, rising to counterattack. A Viet Cong survivor later described it as the most terrifying moment of the battle. It was as if the earth opened and swallowed our attack. The metal vehicles came from nowhere. The Australians were shouting and shooting. We could not stop them. The VC assault broke, not because they ran out of courage, but because they'd run into something stronger. By 7 p.m., it was over. The Viet Cong had withdrawn, leaving hundreds of bodies in the plantation. D Company, 108 men, had held against a force more than 20 times their size. 18 Australians were dead, 24 wounded. But they hadn't broken. They hadn't run. They'd stood, and the Viet Cong would never forget it. The withdrawal itself was chaotic. Units that had been organized into assault formations were now scattered, broken, moving back through the plantation in small groups. Officers had lost contact with many of their men. The carefully planned attack had dissolved into a rout. As the VC pulled back, they left behind not just bodies, but equipment, weapons, ammunition, documents. Everything they'd brought to destroy D Company now lay abandoned in the mud. The Australian forward positions could hear them moving through the rubber trees, wounded men calling for help, officers trying to rally their troops. The sounds of an army in retreat. D Company didn't pursue. They were exhausted, low on ammunition, and had their own wounded to care for. But they'd accomplished something remarkable. They'd broken a regiment, not through superior numbers or overwhelming firepower, but through discipline, courage, and the simple refusal to quit when every tactical calculation said they should. The VC commanders conducting their withdrawal knew they'd failed. But more than that, they knew they'd encountered something they hadn't expected. An enemy that fought with a level of cohesion and determination they'd rarely seen. In the coming days, as the VC regrouped and counted their losses, the full scale of the disaster would become clear. Hundreds dead, more wounded, equipment lost. And worse than the material losses, the psychological impact on surviving troops who'd been told the Australians would break and had instead watched their own formations shatter against Australian defensive fire. This wasn't just a tactical defeat. It was a revelation. The Australians were not like other foreign forces. They could not be broken through conventional means. They would have to be fought differently, more carefully, with greater respect for their capabilities. The Battle of Long Tan was over, but its lessons were just beginning to be understood. The morning after Long Tan, as the rain finally stopped, the scale of what happened became clear. 245 Viet Cong bodies were counted in and around the Australian perimeter. Documents captured later suggested total casualties killed and wounded exceeded 600. One regiment shattered. In the weeks that followed, VC commanders conducted their own after-action analysis. What went wrong? How did a company of Australians survive an attack that should have annihilated them? The answers are in the captured documents, the prisoner interrogations, the reports that filtered back through intelligence channels. And what emerges is a picture of profound miscalculation. The first mistake: assuming the Australians would fight like the Americans. This wasn't an insult to American forces. American tactics emphasized firepower and mobility. Call in airstrikes, use artillery, bring overwhelming force to bear. Effective, but different. The Australians fought like infantrymen who trusted their rifles more than air support that might not come. Fire discipline wasn't just a skill. It was doctrine, drilled into every soldier from basic training. You have 20 rounds in your magazine. Make every single one count. When the VC attacked in waves, expecting the Australians to panic fire and run dry, they instead ran into controlled, aimed fire that never let up. Sections rotated. One fires. One reloads. Overlapping coverage. The VC had faced conscript armies that broke under pressure. They hadn't faced professional infantry who stayed calm when surrounded. The second mistake: believing the weather would protect them. Monsoon rain, near zero visibility, mud everywhere. Surely, the VC thought, the Australian artillery would be useless. They were catastrophically wrong. The New Zealand gunners attached to 1st Australian Task Force were among the best in the world. And the Australians' forward observers, men like Maury Stanley, were calling in fire missions with precision that shocked the enemy. Coordinates relayed through the rain, guns laid in seconds, rounds landing within 50 meters of Australian positions. Danger close, but accurate. A captured VC document stated, enemy artillery response was faster than expected. Accuracy in poor weather exceeded our assumptions. Heavy casualties resulted. Translation: we thought we were safe in the rain. We weren't. But the third mistake was the most important. The Viet Cong believed that any unit, under enough pressure, would break, that morale would crack, that men would stop following orders, that survival instinct would overcome discipline. It was a reasonable assumption. They'd seen it happen before. French units, South Vietnamese units, even some American units. Under sustained attack, casualties mounting, ammunition running low, men break. But mateship isn't just a word Australians use. It's a functional system. When a man knows his mates won't leave him, that if he goes down, someone will come for him, fear changes. It doesn't disappear, but it's shared, distributed across the section, the platoon, the company. No one wants to be the first to run. No one wants to let their mates down, so no one runs. The Viet Cong noticed this during the battle and documented it afterward. Australian soldiers were dragging wounded men back under fire. Ammo runners were sprinting through kill zones to resupply sections. When one part of the line was under pressure, others shifted to support without being ordered. One VC report noted, the Australians did not fight as individuals. They fought as a collective. Breaking one man did not break the unit. In the end, the Viet Cong miscalculated the one thing that mattered most. Not firepower, not numbers. Will. The will to stand when everything says run. The will to fight when the odds are impossible. The will to hold the line because your mates are counting on you. The Viet Cong had plenty of will themselves. But at Long Tan, they met Australians and discovered theirs wasn't stronger. After Long Tan, the 275th Regiment pulled back to rebuild. They'd lost nearly a third of their strength in one afternoon. But more importantly, they'd lost something else: the belief that Australians could be beaten through conventional assault. In the months following Long Tan, Viet Cong tactical assessments changed. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed a new respect and caution regarding Australian forces. The VC noted several things. 1. Australians fought differently from Americans. They patrolled in smaller groups, quieter, more patient, harder to detect. Their ambushes were sudden and deadly, set with precision, sprung without warning. 2. Australian fire discipline was exceptional. VC forces learned not to expect Australians to waste ammunition. Every burst meant casualties. 3. Australian NCO leadership was formidable. The Viet Cong respected the corporal and sergeant class. They saw how Australian sections operated independently, professionally, with clear command structure, even in chaos. And 4. Australians were hard to break psychologically. Standard tactics: isolation, surprise, massed assault that worked on other forces didn't reliably work on Australians. One VC training document from late 1966 stated, Australian units should be considered dangerous at all levels. Avoid engagement unless numerical superiority is overwhelming. Do not assume they will withdraw under pressure. This represented a fundamental shift in how the Viet Cong approached combat with Australian forces. Prior to Long Tan, the standing guidance was to treat Australians similarly to other Western forces: dangerous, yes, but ultimately vulnerable to the same tactics that had worked throughout the war. After Long Tan, that changed. New training emphasized caution when facing Australian patrols. Scouts were instructed to give Australian positions wider berth. Ambush planning now accounted for the likelihood of accurate, sustained return fire rather than panic. Local commanders were authorized to break contact with Australian forces rather than risk heavy casualties in sustained engagements. The VC also began studying Australian patrol patterns more carefully. They noticed the Australians used different movement techniques than the Americans. Smaller groups, often moving at night, with navigation skills that suggested extensive training. The Australians seemed comfortable in the jungle in a way that surprised the VC. They also noted the Australian approach to base security. The defenses around Nui Dat were constantly patrolled, with active defense extending kilometers from the main base. This made it nearly impossible to concentrate forces for another large-scale attack without being detected. But perhaps most significant was the change in how individual VC soldiers viewed the Australians. Stories from Long Tan spread through the ranks. The men who fought there told others what they'd witnessed: an enemy that didn't break, that held position when surrounded, that maintained fire discipline when chaos should have reigned. These stories created a psychological effect the VC leadership couldn't ignore. Their troops were now hesitant to engage Australians unless absolutely necessary. The confidence that had characterized earlier engagements was replaced by caution, sometimes bordering on fear. This wasn't defeatism. The VC remained committed to their cause and continued fighting effectively against other forces. But when it came to Australians, a new calculus emerged. Engaging them meant accepting casualties that might not be worth the tactical gain. Better to avoid them when possible, and engage only when the circumstances were overwhelmingly favorable. Over the years, as veterans from both sides have spoken more openly, a clearer picture has emerged. What did the Viet Cong really think of the Australians? The words that come up again and again: quiet, professional, accurate, stubborn. The VC admired the Australian approach to jungle warfare. They recognized soldiers who understood the terrain, moved carefully, and didn't rely solely on technology. They respected the loyalty Australians showed to each other. Mateship, as a concept, made sense to the VC. They had their own version of it. Seeing Australians live up to it under fire, under pressure, when it would have been easier to break earned respect, a former Viet Cong soldier interviewed years later said, "The Australians were very dangerous. They moved like us, quietly, patiently, but they shot more accurately, and they never left their wounded behind. Never." Another recalled, "We learned to be more careful around Australians. They were not loud like the Americans. They were quiet, like hunters." And perhaps most telling, at Long Tan, we thought we would destroy them. Instead, they taught us not to underestimate anyone. They fought like men defending their home, even though they were far from it. Long Tan changed VC tactics in Phuoc Tuy Province. After August 1966, large-scale attacks against Australian positions became rare. The VC adapted. Smaller ambushes, hit and run, avoiding set-piece battles. Because they'd learned. For the remainder of the Australian presence in Vietnam, the Viet Cong treated them differently. More caution, more respect, an understanding that engaging Australians meant casualties, high ones, even in victory. One captured VC document instructed, "Do not assume the Australians will break. Prepare for extended engagement. Ensure withdrawal routes are clear." The Australians had earned something rare in war, not fear for fear's sake, but professional respect, the kind of respect soldiers give to other soldiers who know their business, who stand their ground, who do their job even when the job is impossible. This respect manifested in practical ways during the remaining years of Australian involvement in Vietnam. VC forces would often choose to disengage rather than press an attack against Australian positions. Intelligence reports noted multiple instances where VC units, upon identifying Australian forces, withdrew to seek easier targets. This wasn't cowardice. It was professional military judgment. The VC were fighting a long war of attrition. Trading heavy casualties for limited tactical gains against Australians made no strategic sense when other targets were available. Some Australian veterans recall the strange dynamic this created. Patrols would find evidence of VC forces that had clearly detected them and chosen to avoid contact. Trails that suddenly veered away, camps that had been hastily abandoned, signs of observation that never resulted in ambush. The VC were watching. They knew where the Australians were, but they were choosing not to fight unless circumstances were decisively in their favor. This created an odd form of mutual respect. The Australians knew the VC were skilled, determined fighters. The VC knew the Australians were the same. Both sides understood that engagement meant casualties, and both sides within the constraints of their strategic objectives preferred to avoid unnecessary bloodshed when tactical necessity didn't demand it. It's worth noting that this respect didn't mean the war became gentler in Phuoc Tuy Province. Combat still occurred. Men still died. But the nature of that combat changed. The VC avoided set-piece battles with Australian forces. They focused on harassment, mine warfare, and attacks on less defended targets. And the Australians, for their part, adapted their tactics to hunt VC forces that were now more cautious and harder to pin down. The war became a chess match of patience and professionalism, played by soldiers who understood each other's capabilities all too well. 18 Australians died at Long Tan. Their names are carved at the Long Tan Cross, remembered every August 18th by the men who stood with them, and by a nation that understands what they did. The veterans of D Company didn't ask for glory. They did their job. They held the line. They trusted their training, their leaders, and their mates. And when everything said they should break, when the rain was falling and the enemy was everywhere and ammunition was running out, they refused. That's not bravado. That's not propaganda. That's what happened. But it wasn't all. It was everything. Because when the Viet Cong looked at what happened at Long Tan, when they analyzed it, documented it, learned from it, they understood they'd faced something they hadn't expected. Not invincibility, not superhuman courage, but something just as powerful: discipline, professionalism, loyalty, and a stubborn refusal to quit. The Australians at Long Tan weren't just another battalion. They were something the Viet Cong had to respect, something they feared, something they remembered. Long after the last shot was fired, long after the rain stopped falling, long after the war ended. Because August 18th, 1966, wasn't just a battle. It was the day the Viet Cong learned what Australians already knew. Mateship isn't a slogan. It's the reason you stand, even when everything says run. Especially then. The Battle of Long Tan remains one of the most significant actions fought by Australian forces in Vietnam. D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, was awarded unit citations for their actions. Individual decorations included Distinguished Conduct Medals, military medals, and mentions in dispatches. The men of D Company and the artillery and APC crews who supported them exemplified the finest traditions of Australian military service. Lest we forget, in the years since the battle, historians and military analysts have studied Long Tan as a case study in small unit tactics and the importance of training and cohesion. The ratio of forces: 108 Australians holding off more than 2,000 Viet Cong has drawn comparisons to famous last stands throughout military history. But the men who were there resist such grandiose comparisons. To them, it wasn't a heroic last stand. It was doing the job they'd been trained to do, following their orders, trusting their training, looking after their mates. The simplicity of that explanation belies the extraordinary nature of what they accomplished. In military terms, what D Company did shouldn't have been possible. The tactical mathematics don't work. One company, isolated, against a regiment should be destroyed in minutes, not hold for hours. But mathematics don't account for the human factors: discipline under fire, trust in leadership, the refusal to abandon your mates, the muscle memory of training taking over when conscious thought becomes impossible, the simple, stubborn determination to hold because that's what you're supposed to do. These factors don't appear in tactical manuals. They can't be quantified or calculated, but they're real. And at Long Tan, they made all the difference. The legacy of Long Tan extends beyond the battle itself. It shaped how Australia's military thinks about training, leadership, and the importance of small unit cohesion. The lessons learned there about fire discipline, tactical patience, and the critical role of NCOs continue to influence how Australian infantry train today. For the Vietnamese veterans who fought against them, Long Tan remains a memory of facing an enemy that earned their respect through professional competence and unshakable resolve. In the years after the war, when veterans from both sides began meeting, that respect became more explicit. Former enemies could acknowledge what they'd recognized even in combat, that they'd faced worthy opponents who fought with skill and honor. And for Australia as a nation, Long Tan has become a symbol of the qualities Australians like to see in themselves. Not flashy heroism or glory-seeking, but quiet competence, loyalty to mates. The ability to stay calm under pressure and do what needs to be done, no matter how difficult. These aren't just military virtues. They're the values that built a nation in a harsh land. And on August 18, 1966, in a muddy rubber plantation on the other side of the world, those values were tested in the crucible of combat and proved strong enough to hold. That's why Australians remember Long Tan, not as a celebration of war, but as a reminder of what their soldiers were capable of when everything was on the line. And why? Every year, on August 18th, veterans gather to remember the 18 men who didn't come home, to honor their sacrifice, and to ensure that what they did, what all of D Company did that day, is never forgotten. Because some battles are more than just tactical victories. They're defining moments that reveal the character of the men who fought them and the nation they represented. Long Tan was one of those battles, and the Viet Cong knew it. They learned it the hard way, in the rain and mud and blood of that rubber plantation. They learned that Australians could be beaten, but they couldn't be broken. And in war, that difference matters more than anything else.